Thank you very much. It's a treat to be with all of you in this beautiful place. The biggest problem faced by the United States, in my opinion, is the coming inability of the government, the Treasury bonds, the federal government, to sell the Treasury bonds. Most people believe there's going to be a federal debt crunch in the 2030s as the boomers age. And indeed, we know that about 10,000 boomers are turning age 65 every day. In my estimation, the crunch is coming materially earlier than the 2030s. And my guess is that it's going to happen likely between 2017 and the end of 2019, to pull numbers out of the air. There's no precision here. On occasion, I may say this will happen, but as we all know, none of us knows the future, certainly not I. So a little history about the world. All of you have studied history. There's a lot of myopia in America with our fabulous success we've had for so long. Many people think this is a young country. Many people think it's the wealthiest country on the planet. It isn't. And in terms of a young country, there's an important distinction to be made between the culture, the ancient Teutonic culture, the old culture of Italy, the Chinese culture. But in the financial markets, which is where all of us operate, of course we love to go to France and enjoy the French culture. But in the financial markets, we cannot buy the culture. The things we buy are the stocks, the bonds, the currency, and the local real estate. So let us have some clarity of thought and make that distinction. So now let us look around the world. Arguably with England, the US is the world's oldest country. And even England still has no constitution, although the thing operates sort of with some stability. And so the US is, in the grand scheme of things, an old country, and even we were split apart by the bloodiest war in our history 150 years ago, killed 600,000 Americans, which is more than died in all the other wars combined. Now, I'm bearish on stocks. I don't have any stocks anywhere in the world, and the fabulous presentations by Walter Isaacson and Ian McCavity took the words out of my mouth. So I'm going to cover some other things. I'm a deflation guy. I am bullish on gold, but the points I'm going to make here today are in addition to my bearishness on stocks. I'm bearish on stocks right now anyway. Now we add this into the mix, some things we'll talk in more detail about as we go. It makes me even more bearish. So let's look at the history of nations. Even we were split apart. It was doubtful as to whether we would continue as one nation. And we're old. See, let's take it some other countries, for example. Finland didn't exist as a separate country until 1917. Much younger country than we are. There are 200 members of the United Nations. Half of them have come into existence since the end of WW2. Austria was a part of the Austria-Hungary Empire until 1917. Make it 1918. Greece was a part of the Ottoman Empire until 1832. Didn't gain independence till then. And Greece has defaulted on its debt 8 or 9 times since then. For Greece to default is just another ho-hum experience. Japan had an emperor in WW2, then we wrote their current constitution after the end of the war, as we did for the German Constitution. In Germany, in terms of the stocks, the bonds, the currency, and the real estate, you went to zero twice in the 20th century alone. You all know about the Weimar mark they had, then we had the Reichsmark, went to zero, then you had the D-mark. The D-mark has been, of course, since replaced by the euro. The French Revolution was in 1789. They had chaos for a while. They had one currency called the mandat, and the mandat only lasted 9 months. The currency went to zero in 9 months, and it was replaced by another currency. And they had currency chaos until Napoleon came in, made himself a dictator effectively, putting the crown on his own head, which he insisted on doing rather than having the religious authorities do it for him. He put France on the gold standard, which ended this currency chaos. I think it's unlikely that the US or any other nation will adopt the gold standard. It would be one of the finest things we could do, but it would be a very difficult thing to do. And my sense of the nation, and part of my view depends upon my reading of the American psyche. My view is the country couldn't stand the toughness that would result from a hard currency implemented today. And by the way, studies have shown that if the US, for example, were to adopt gold as money, given the amount of money that is in existence and the amount of gold that's in existence, then gold would have to be $8,000 to $10,000 an ounce if gold were used as money. The total amount of above ground gold in the world is a cube. One side of the cube is the length of a tennis court. That's all there is in the whole world. And as we have discussed variously, the gold miners aren't doing such a fine job, so the amount of gold being produced to add to that cube is a little bit like this. But the amount of currency being produced in which this gold is priced is going up, way up. So it's pretty much a slam dunk that ultimately the price of gold in dollar terms will go up. Voltaire, the French, that was a pseudonym or a nom de plume, as the French would say, in the 1700s, said, quote, paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value -0. And it has been true for every currency that has existed in world history. There have been roughly 2,000 currencies, as far as we can tell, that have existed in the history of the world. All have been debased, meaning the base of it was degraded, clipping the edges and so forth. The Romans did that. Every nation has done it. So every currency, constitution, civilization, dictatorship that has ever existed in world history has ultimately gone to 0. 0. Not a single exception in world history. You may have read the fabulous Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote a volume of history books like this, beautifully written. And Will Durant, at the end of that multi-decade project, said, if Rome fell and Sparta fell, what chance does any nation have? No reason to be depressed about this. I plan to make a lot of money on it. But it is important to have the big picture perspective in mind. It's very important, so you won't be blindsided like the people who didn't see the Argentinian bond default coming in '01, which really created some chaos there. The various other defaults. My guess is that the U.S. is not going, and we'll talk more details. You have some charts in front of you. No, you don't have to look at them yet. We'll go through them slowly. My guess is that what's going to happen is the U.S. will be unable to sell its bonds, like the U.K. couldn't sell its bonds in '76, and they were bailed out by us and by the World Bank, but no one is big enough or inclined to bail us out. And the debt problem is very serious. It's so serious, nobody really enjoys talking about it. And neither political party is trying to address the situation. And we, as you know, we have debt running up all around the world. So what we have, if we take a look now at the first chart that you have, this is the ratio of debt to GDP. And it shows the temporary run-up in debt in relationship to GDP during World War II. And we borrowed a lot of money to finance our way through WW2. I had always thought that after the war, the U.S. paid down the debt. Very good, Walter's shaking his head. Had paid down the debt, and that's what made the ratio fall. It is not true, which we'll see in just a moment. We borrowed a lot, and what happened there are two ways out of the current crunch. One of those ways is rapid economic growth. Needless to say, I don't see that happening. So then what's happened is the debt has gone way up and the economy is slowing a bit. So now we have not a temporary debt to GDP problem, but this is structural. This is being normalized in the American psyche. The public doesn't think anything wrong with this. In Keynesian theory, a well-run nation in good times, and these are sort of good times, not a boom, will run a surplus by the government. And so the government will then accumulate a pot of money, today widely called a sovereign wealth fund. Norway's sovereign wealth fund has enough money in it for $250,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. Singapore has 2 sovereign wealth funds. The so-called wealthiest nation on earth, how much is our sovereign wealth fund? It is 0. It's not my cell phone, it's over here and off. Our sovereign wealth fund is 0. We have none. No such thing. And so you have this pot of money in the theory of a well-run nation that we accumulate. We save some money. The government has extra revenues compared to its expenses in a good time. Then when the inevitable downturn comes, you spend the pot of money and cushion the downturn. It's all well and good. What has become normalized in America is that in good times, like now, the fiscal year that ended 2 days ago on September 30th, the deficit was, they haven't figured out finally what it is yet, but around $500 billion deficit. And in 2009, we ran a deficit of $1.9 trillion in a bad time. So we run huge, staggering deficits in bad times. We run big deficits in good times. The key is whether GDP is growing more rapidly than the debt. And these days, it is not. The debt is growing more rapidly than GDP. In a large extent, the way I look at it, we are living in Zimbabwe. And we have the president of Zimbabwe standing up here with me. And the president of Zimbabwe says, well, yes, everything is fine in Zimbabwe. We run a big deficit in good times, and we run staggering deficits in bad times, but it's okay because our central bank is buying 75% of our bonds, and that's going to make it perfectly okay. And we would look at this character like he was smoking something. But that's what we are doing. We look at ourselves. We see smoking something. Now, as the estimable Mr. Zimmerman said, a nation gets the government it deserves. As long as we say, well, he's no good, or he's no good, or this guy, we miss the point. It is us. It is we. We collectively have elected whoever sits in Washington. They reflect the consciousness. For those of you who are familiar with the kind of consciousness and energy kind of terms, they reflect the consciousness of the population. It's with great reluctance that I'm so bearish on the United States. From 1945 until 1980, nothing magic happened in 1980, but around then, from that period from 45 when the war ended till 1980, the U.S. was the unquestioned world leader, politically, militarily, in finance, and in education. Unquestioned world leader. In 1980, on the OECD test, and they measured age 6 and age 18, we were number 1, 2, and 3 in the world. And we didn't spend that much money either. Today, on those same tests, we're number 24, 25 in the world, despite spending more per pupil than any nation but Switzerland. So when I hear somebody say spend more on education, that's not really what the problem is. If we take an American 18-year-old in math, and they measure it on math, science, and reading, because they're cross-cultural enough, they get a good sense of it, that we take the American math student at age 18, who is in the top 1 percentile of all 18-year-olds in math in the United States, and we take her to Japan, she would be in the middle of the class. in the 50th percentile. The one we just can't believe how fabulous she is. We'd be in the middle of the class. In finance, in 1980, the United States was the world's largest creditor nation. And through all of economic history, prosperity has flowed to the creditor nations. Today, the U.S. is the world's largest debtor nation by far. And the debt is getting to be a problem. We've normalized it. Some of you are saying, yes, I think this is true. Some of you are saying, oh, well, we've lived with that so long. Somehow we'll do this. We'll inflate our way out of it. Well, let's pause on that point because we hear this sometimes. Inflation has never brought prosperity to any nation. Inflation has always brought very difficult times. People living in the dirt, governments collapsing. Inflation has never been an answer. Then we have a little inconvenient fact about the nature of our debt. Many people don't realize, including some of the very smart people I had lunch with today, that the average maturity of Treasury debt issued by our nation is 5 years. It's the average maturity. If those of us in this room ran Treasury, I submit, at least my vote, would be to go ahead and pay the higher price necessary to lengthen the maturity with rates this low and issue more 20, 30-year bonds to lock in today's current low rates. It would cost us some money because, as you know, the bills are zero, the 5-year bonds are whatever they are, 150 basis points probably. I haven't looked at it lately. Even the 10s, as you know, are about 2.4, 2.5%. So it would cost us some money, but it would give us some isolation, some insulation from a rise in rates. And as Walter has talked about, rates are going to go up at some point. They may have already gone up because they hit 1.4% on the 10s in July of 2012. That was the bottom. Some people would say, no, it was really 1.395. So, what this means is that you cannot inflate your way out of short-term debt. If the average maturity of U.S. Treasury bonds are 25 years, yeah, inflation would chip away at the value of it. It's not a solution, but it would mitigate it a little bit. But you can't inflate your way out of short-term debt. Just can't be done because what happens is inflation comes along, the rates just spiral up. So the prosperity, as I mentioned, has always gone to the creditor nations. This is a staggering debtor nation with no hope of fixing it. So let us turn the page and look at the two components. This is a ratio. It's simply the ratio of the debt to the GDP. And yours truly got a little education on this just in the last couple of weeks. I had never taken the time to expand that line into its two components. And I said, my impression that we had paid off the debt after the war was out to lunch. What happened was the debt plateaued, the economy took off like a rocket, bringing the ratio down, as we saw on the first page. And you see here, before WW2, this nation didn't have any material debt. Today, federal spending runs right about $3.7 trillion, which is right about 22%, 23% of GDP. In 1900, federal spending was 4% of GDP. That's all it was, 4% of GDP. So we didn't have any material debt before WW2, as you see here. And I use a log scale. As you know, a straight line on a log scale is a constant rate of change. And we do that when there's big differences on the vertical axis. If the vertical axis just gets multiplied by 3 or 4 times, it doesn't matter so much. But when we have a huge thing run up, you get a better picture with a log scale. And so what we see happening these days, GDP is a shade over $17 trillion. And the debt is 17.4 trillion. So we have flattening GDP growth and the debt continuing to go up even in good economic times. And so we see that the dotted line of the debt has now eclipsed GDP. Now, we don't have any way of saying, well, this is the absolute level of debt that we can handle. As someone mentioned, Japan's debt ratio is materially higher, and this one is higher, and somehow they're going along. And we have a study, Rogoff and Reinhardt, when it gets above 90%, then things tend to slow down. It's pretty obvious. So there's nothing magic to say about when the crunch is going to come. We'll get in my opinion, about a 2-year warning from the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury bonds. Once they pass north of, say, 5%, this country will, for sure, in my opinion, enter a classic debt spiral. Rates go up, the deficit goes up, borrowing goes up, debt goes up, credit rating goes down, interest expense goes up. It's or more likely, like this, is what the thing is inevitably going to do unless one of two actions is taken, which we'll talk about in a minute. Personally, I don't see either of those two happening, but none of us knows the future. You know, we say this on current trends, this is going to happen, but maybe something changes. I don't know the future. In a strong sense, this chart is conservative, because the U.S., unlike most nations, have states that issue bonds and cities and counties issuing bonds. And what we call the muni market includes state debt and hospital bonds and all revenue, school systems, sewer bonds, all that kind of stuff, the total of which is right about $3.8 trillion. So it's all government debt. So really, by rights, if I wanted to make this dramatic, I'm not trying to make it dramatic. This is the most conservative case that one could reasonably state. And this is straight from the government websites, from the OMB and the BEA websites. So we could add that debt. Georgia, where I live in Atlanta, gets 30.4%, funny, I happen to remember that number, looking at it recently, 30.4% of its revenues from the federal government. Now, this is typical of states. So we might have the sense, oh, well, the federal government goes down, but we here in Atlanta are going to be okay. This thing is all tied together in one kind of collective system. And the idea of bankruptcy is becoming normalized in the American consciousness. We see Detroit go belly up. Well, nobody gets too excited about it. In Stockton, California went belly up. I don't have a list of these, a category. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the capital of Pennsylvania, went belly up. Birmingham, Alabama, went belly, the county, I think Jefferson County it was, where Birmingham is, went belly up. So we see an increasing acceptance of bankruptcy as kind of an American norm. Politically, I'm a libertarian. I'm not coming at this from a Republican or Democrat. You have to have a social safety net. It's better for the people who need it. It's better for those of us in this room, so they're not hitting us on the head. It's better for everybody. So you have to have some government. But if I were emperor, I'd cut the government by 2/3. Defense spending in the United States is 18% of federal spending. Social programs collectively are 2/3 of federal spending. I encourage everyone to look at the White House website and look at the budget of the United States government. It shows right there, it gives you history going back decades, shows you where the money goes in this country, and it's absolutely staggering. Some people who are very concerned about the level of defense spending are just perfectly okay, it's 18% of federal spending, are perfectly okay with spending 2/3 on social programs. Should we address that? Oh, no. They vote for us. So I would make radical changes. I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. So this increasing acceptance of bankruptcy is a concern. If I were emperor, when we had the 08-09 crunch, And General Motors needed to be bailed out, AIG needed to be bailed out, which was really a bailout of Goldman Sachs, with whom AIG had a contract. The survival of Goldman, I'm not intimately into these details, but apparently Goldman would have gone down if they hadn't bailed out AIG. So I would have let it go down. In 1907, we had a thing called the Panic of '07, which in my view was influenced by the great San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. Everything is tied together. It was a big wipeout of that major West Coast city. And in '07, pretty much every bank in the country went belly up. And Morgan got them together in the room and said, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and they did it.